Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. The air above Two Forks Canyon was a thick, coppery dust cloud, not from a coming storm, but from the brutal beating of a single desperate heart. Alara Vance, a woman whose spirit had been tempered harder than any blacksmith's steel by the raw grief of her husband's grave, knelt in the blinding ochre haze. Her only wealth, a majestic bay stallion named Vigil, the last gift from her late love and the only reliable thing she had left to carry her daughter, Lyra, to safety should the worst come, was pawing the ground nervously. But the fear in Vigil's eyes was nothing compared to the fear currently freezing the blood in Alara's veins. She wasn't kneeling in prayer, nor was she submitting to the brutal drought that had turned her homestead into a crumbling monument of shattered dreams. Alara was kneeling beside a dying man, an Apache scout named Nantan, a shadow from the wilderness, whose chest was currently painted a deep arterial crimson, a fresh, gaping wound that was now staining the thirsty earth a grotesque, dark mud. This scene, captured by the merciless midday sun, was a study in tragic irony. A woman of the West, whose people despised and hunted the Apache, now sacrificing her last possession for a man she was supposed to fear, a man whose fading breaths were a testament to the hatred that had brought him to her door. Her decision, immediate and irreversible, was driven by a deeper, more primal code than any town law or prejudice, a code of life for life, and a quiet, internal belief that a debt to fate must always be paid, regardless of the currency. The sight of the man, barely clinging to life, the fever already a raging fire behind his eyes, forced the single, most impossible choice she'd ever faced. The choice, however, was not one of morality, but of cold, stark survival math. Alara's ranch, a lonely outpost 50 miles from the nearest semblance of civilization in the cursed town of Redemption's Hold, had not seen rain in 7 months. Every crop had withered, the well was a stone-dry throat in the earth, and the only path to the river lay through the treacherous land now claimed by a venomous land-hungry cattle baron named Silas Thorne. Thorne had offered to buy her out for pennies, knowing she had no other choice, and she had spat in his face. Now Thorne's riders were a daily, dusty menace on the horizon, their threats subtle as a rattlesnake's hiss, but constant as the sun. Vigil was her only trade asset, the only piece of value that could be sold in Redemption's Hold for enough supplies and feed to last through the winter, or, more darkly, for a fast escape to the relative safety of the North. To give him up meant to condemn her daughter, Lyra, and herself to the slow, certain death of starvation, or the quicker, brutal dispossession by Thorne's thugs. Yet, as the Apache's eyelids fluttered, a raw, silent plea in his eyes, Alara saw not the enemy of her people, but a reflection of her own profound helplessness, a mirror image of the desperate clinging to life that she and Lyra had shared since her husband's death. The fever had melted away the hard, warrior lines of the Apache's face, revealing only the fundamental, fragile humanity beneath. She knew in that instant she could not watch another soul die on her land. Her fingers, calloused from years of unforgiving labor, moved with the decisive, terrifying certainty of a woman making a death vow. She took the heavy, carved silver bridle from Vigil's head, the metal cool and solid in her palm, its weight a sudden, suffocating symbol of the life she was giving up. "I don't know who you are, or what debt you are paying, but you will live," she whispered, her voice rough as sandpaper against the dry wind, addressing the fevered man, yet also attempting to convince a horrified part of herself. She had a small, forgotten canteen with a precious half-cup of water, meant for Lyra in an emergency. She poured the last life-giving drops onto the Apache's cracked lips, the small act a final seal on her impossible bargain. She gently lifted the heavy, beaded satchel from the warrior's waist, a small worn leather pouch, and found a handful of raw, uncut turquoise stones inside, They were beautiful, ancient, and utterly worthless in redemption's hold, where cash or livestock were the only respected currency. This was no trade. This was a gift, a sacrifice of the highest order. She then wrapped the unconscious Nantan in her husband's old heavy woolen blanket, its familiar scent of wood smoke and leather a silent, searing memory. She knew that to care for him, to keep him alive, she would need to make the agonizing trip into town, a journey that only Vigil could guarantee she survived. Ilara stood up, her skirt covered in the Apache's blood, the scent of copper and dust clinging to her like a shroud. She walked over to Vigil, a magnificent creature whose coat shimmered like dark mahogany in the sun, and buried her face in his warm neck. The horse nickered softly, sensing the profound grief and the monumental farewell in her touch. "You go now, boy," she murmured into his mane, her words catching on a sudden stinging lump in her throat. "Go live. Go free. You belong to the hills now. You don't belong to a dying farm." With a final wrenching slap on his flank, she drove him away from the meager fence line. Vigil hesitated, looking back at her with large, intelligent eyes that mirrored the confusion in her own soul, before finally turning and galloping away, disappearing into the blinding orange dust clouds toward the distant, shimmering mountains. A dark, sleek phantom swallowed by the hostile land. He was gone. The only way she had to save her daughter was now a ghost on the wind, a desperate gamble on the fleeting life of a man who was her supposed enemy. She looked down at the pale, still form of Nantan, the silence of the farm now deafening without the horse's presence. The realization slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. She was stranded, utterly alone, with a dying Apache, 30 miles from any help, and Thorne's men were due for their afternoon visit. A flicker of movement caught her eye, a glint of metal from the highest point of the canyon's rim, an impossible distance away, but clear enough for her trained eye to recognize. It was the scope of a rifle, followed by the brief, terrifying silhouette of a man on horseback, unmoving, observing her. Thorne's man was watching. He had seen the horse leave. He had seen her now completely isolated and vulnerable. A slow, predatory smile seemed to stretch across the distance, a silent, chilling signal. The waiting game was over. The game had just changed from a negotiation to a siege. Ilara clutched the heavy rifle she kept beside the porch, a faded, trusted Winchester, her knuckles white. The stakes were no longer about the farm, or even her life, but the secret, fragile life of her daughter Lyra, currently asleep inside the silent, heat-choked cabin. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a violent, desperate drumbeat in the sudden, echoing silence. The Apache, Nantan, was a dead weight now, a ticking time bomb. But in her mind, a new, terrible thought began to form, a desperate, irrational hope born of pure adrenaline. If he survived, perhaps she had purchased not just a life, but an impossible spiritual debt, a debt that might just save her. She had given her only horse for a dying Apache. Now, she would have to wait for the dawn to know if that sacrifice meant freedom or a slow, agonizing demise. The dust settled, revealing the ranch as a tiny besieged island in a vast indifferent ocean of red earth, and the waiting began. The sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the Two Forks Canyon, plunging the valley into a velvet darkness pierced only by the sharp, distant cries of nocturnal hunters. Ilara's vigilance was a sharp, physical pain in her chest, a constant pressure against the suffocating silence. She had moved Nantan into the small, dirt-floored lean-to behind the cabin, the coolest, most secluded spot, covering his wounded body with damp cloths stripped from her last precious quilt. His fever had spiked, the heat radiating off his skin like a furnace, and his breathing was now a shallow, ragged rasp that echoed ominously in the quiet space. Every few minutes, he would mutter in his native tongue, sharp, unintelligible bursts of urgency that sounded like warnings or commands. This was a man of the wilderness, of action and power, reduced to a trembling child by a bullet and the scorching fever of infection. Ilara, worked by the dim light of a tallow candle, the flame flickering with every breath of the rising night wind, her shadow stretching long and distorted across the wall. She knew the danger. The bullet was still inside him, deep in the muscle, and without the proper tools to retrieve it, the infection would surely claim him before the dawn. The only thing she had left to combat the poison was boiling water, clean linen, and a poultice made of willow bark, and the last of her grandmother's dried lavender, a hopeful yet terribly inadequate medicine against the raw power of lead and festering flesh. The clock was ticking, a silent, deadly rhythm that measured out the Apache's remaining life in minutes. The true weight of her decision, the sacrifice of vigil, pressed down on her now, heavy and cold as the night air. In the stark reality of the moonless darkness, Ilara's self-condemnation was immediate and brutal. She had traded her only way out, her daughter's safety net, for a stranger, an Apache warrior whose people had been nothing but a source of fear and conflict to the settlers. She felt a burning rush of panic and self-loathing, the kind of crushing regret that made her stomach clench with physical pain. What right did she have to gamble Lyra's future on a fleeting, reckless moment of humanitarian instinct? She glanced toward the main cabin, where 5-year-old Lyra slept, her peaceful breathing a sound that was both a blessing and a torment. Lyra was the living image of her dead husband, the only sun that had not set in Ilara's life. If anything happened, if Thorn's men came now, there would be no horse to outrun them, no chance to flee to the neighboring county where her sister lived. They would be trapped, defenseless. This was the dark pattern break of Chapter 2. The heroic, sacrificial act of the previous chapter now turned into a terrifying, selfish mistake in the cold, hard light of the current circumstances. The conflict was no longer external. It was an internal war of conscience, an agonizing doubt that gnawed at her resolve and amplified the sound of the Apache's shallow breaths into a drumming harbinger of doom. A sudden, sharp cry broke the tense silence. Nantan's fevered eyes snapped open, his gaze burning right through the darkness, fixed on something Ilara couldn't see. He lunged upward, his wounded chest protesting with a gush of fresh blood, a guttural sound escaping his lips. Not pain, but a fierce, desperate command. In his hand, he clutched the small, beaded leather satchel she had noticed earlier, the one containing the worthless turquoise stones. With a tremendous effort that cost him a visible, sickening drain of life force, he pushed the pouch toward her. He spoke now, not in his native tongue, but in rough, broken English. The words dragged from a place of profound exhaustion. Debt! Paid! Take! Stones! Go! Run! He tried to sit up, his eyes wide with a terrifying urgency. Ilara realized he wasn't offering the stones as a trade. He was offering them as a warning, a desperate payment to send her away, sensing the danger she was now in because of him. He was trying to push her to abandon him, to save herself. This small, unexpected act of selflessness from a man she thought was consumed by pain shocked her more than any threat. It was the "wait, what?" moment of the chapter, a stunning contradiction to the cruel, savage image of the Apache that the settlers' stories had painted. Ilara pushed him gently but firmly back onto the pallet, the warmth of his skin an alarming sign of the infection's spread. "No," she said, her voice steady now, the doubt suddenly replaced by a quiet, steely resolve born from his sacrifice. "The horse is gone. You do not get to die on my account now. You do not get to choose. You will live, and you will leave here on your own 2 feet. She ignored the offered turquoise, focusing instead on the wound. She understood the deeper conflict now. He felt indebted, and she felt responsible. It was an impossible, silent agreement between 2 people who, by all rights, should have been enemies. Her narration rhythm shifted, becoming short and sharp as she focused on the task. She needed a blade. She needed to dig the bullet out. There was only one thing sharp enough. Her husband's old hunting knife, a relic kept hidden in the floorboards. She pulled it out, the steel glinting dangerously in the candlelight, its edge honed for skinning deer, not saving human life. The air grew thick with tension. The physical pain the man was about to endure was nothing compared to the terrible choice she was about to make. To cut into a living man, to become a surgeon of desperation, with every chance that the wound would kill him faster than the fever. The operation was a nightmare of blood, sweat, and suppressed cries. Ilara tied Nantan's wrists to the support beams of the lean-to, a terrible necessity, and braced herself, her hands shaking not from fear, but from the brutal invasiveness of the act. She heated the knife in the candle flame, a useless attempt at sterilization, and then plunged the tip into the angry, swollen flesh, guided only by the shallow knowledge she had gained from tending to livestock wounds. Nantan bit down hard on a strip of leather she had forced between his teeth, but a deep primal groan still ripped its way out of his throat, a sound that she felt in her own bones. Sweat poured down Ilara's face, mixing with the thick air and the coppery scent of fresh blood. The small brass-case projectile was lodged painfully deep, near the bone. She scraped, she pushed, she fought, and then, with a sickening clink, the bullet tumbled onto the dirt floor. It was small, deformed, and deadly, a dark piece of metal that had come to symbolize all the hatred and conflict of the West. Ilara collapsed back, breathing hard, the task done, but the danger far from over. She applied the poultice, bandaged the wound tightly, and listened to the rain of the man's ragged breathing. She had saved his life, but by doing so, she had exposed her own. The distant glimmer of Thorne's rifle scope, which she had spotted earlier, seemed to burn an invisible hole into the back of her neck. She was now bound to the Apache by a bloody secret, and the price of that secret was her freedom. The last piece of linen was gone, the water was gone, and the dawn would bring not freedom, but a confrontation she was now too weak to meet. The night wore on with a paralyzing slowness, each minute an agonizing expansion of the tension that stretched from Ilara's tightening chest to the silent, observing darkness outside. With the bullet gone, Nantan's fever began a slow, treacherous retreat, but the exhaustion that followed was profound. He lay utterly still, his breathing shallower but steadier, a fragile vessel rescued from the storm. Ilara sat on an overturned bucket just outside the lean-to, her rifle resting across her lap, its cold steel a familiar, necessary comfort. She had pulled the last of her wool shawl around her shoulders, less for warmth than for the feeling of being cloaked, hidden from the watchful eyes of the desert night. The silence between them was thick, a shared understanding of life and death, of the terrible things they had just done together. When Nantan finally stirred again, it was not with a cry or a fevered fit, but with a silent, deliberate opening of his eyes. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time, a long assessing gaze that saw past the dusty widow's dress and the fear, seeing only the raw, defiant courage of a survivor. There were no words, no thank yous, only a deepening, silent intensity in his dark eyes, a powerful, non-verbal confirmation that he understood the monumental sacrifice she had made, a sacrifice that went beyond the healing of his wound. This silent acknowledgement, this profound exchange, was the deepening emotional wound of the chapter. A debt was being forged not in money, but in the lifeblood of two desperate people. Ilara felt her face flush, suddenly self-conscious under his piercing, steady gaze. She looked away, toward the sleeping cabin, needing the sight of Lyra's safe presence to anchor her. "You will not speak of the horse," she finally murmured, her voice a low, gravelly sound that the wind tried to steal. "Not to me, not to anyone. That choice was mine, and I will not regret it. Not yet." She did not say she was afraid to regret it, but the weight of that unsaid fear hung heavy between them. She knew the moment he spoke of vigil, the reality of her daughter's precarious safety would overwhelm her. He remained silent for a long beat, his eyes tracing the lines of her tired face, the dried bloodstains on her hands. Then, with a slow, agonizing effort, he managed to lift his left hand, pointing a single trembling finger toward the beads he wore on his wrist. A thick, intricate, bracelet of carved bone and black stones. He carefully untied the leather cord and pushed the heavy ornament toward her. The gift, a silent extension of the turquoise offer from hours before. This was not a payment for the life she saved, she realized, but a pledge, a promise made in the deep language of his people. She understood, through the sheer emotional weight of the moment, that this was his shield, his medicine, his most sacred possession. She shook her head, pushing the beads back toward his unmoving form. "Keep it. I do not want your protection, Nantan. I only want you to live, so I do not have to carry your death with me, too." The brutal honesty of her confession hung in the air, a raw revelation of her internal struggles. She was not a savior, she was a woman desperate to clear her own spiritual debt, to not allow another death on her conscience. But he surprised her again, his lips curling to a faint, painful smile, the first sign of humanity she had seen on his face. He pressed the beads onto the dirt floor near her rifle, and this time, he spoke only one word, a sound rough with disuse and pain, but perfectly clear. "Thorn." The single name was an instant shift in energy, a sharp, alarming twist that cut through the emotional quietness of the scene. The Apache knew the threat. He had seen the land baron's men, or perhaps he had even been hunted by them. The mystery deepens. Who exactly is Nantan, and what conflict has he dragged to Alara's doorstep? His focus was no longer on his wound or the debt, but on the external enemy that was now waiting to claim her. Alara's eyes widened, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "How do you know that name?" she demanded, the rifle suddenly feeling heavier in her grasp, pointing not at an imaginary threat, but toward the man who might know the truth. She had only ever spoken the name in hushed tones, to her daughter or to herself. Nantan closed his eyes, gathering strength, his breathing catching slightly. When he opened them, the weariness was still there, but now overlaid with a profound, terrifying certainty. "Thorn. Hunting. Long time. Not for land. For gold." The word gold was spat out, a hard metallic taste in the air. This was the big secret, the deep motive, the massive revelation that changed everything. Thorn wasn't just a petty land baron, he was a ruthless prospector, and his interest in her land was not simply based on drought and desperation. He was searching for something, and Nantan, the Apache scout, knew what it was. Her husband, she remembered, had always been secretive about his prospecting, always sketching maps and bringing back strange, heavy stones, though he never found anything of value. She thought of the dried-up well, the barren crops, and realized with a sickening clarity that she had been utterly blind, focused on survival when the real threat was far deeper and far more dangerous than just simple land greed. Nantan coughed, a dry, painful rattle, and continued his effort, adding another terrifying layer to the escalation. Under the well, old markings, his grandfather, before him. He then used his good hand to slowly trace a familiar symbol in the dirt floor of the lean-to, a spiraling feathered snake design that was eerily similar to a faded, almost erased etching she had always ignored on the stone lip of her now dry well. He looked directly at her, his eyes conveying a silent, urgent message. "Thorn thinks you know. Thorn will kill you for what he thinks you possess." This was the powerful internal trigger, the sudden realization that she was not just an independent woman being harassed, but a direct, unwitting target in a generations-long, deadly treasure hunt. The danger had not just escalated, it had become personal and inherited. Alara finally accepted the heavy beaded bracelet, the cool stone beads a solid grounding weight on her wrist. It was no longer a gift, it was a token of alliance, a solemn, silent pact sealed in the blood and secrets of the desert night. The man who was supposed to be her enemy had just become her most essential, and perhaps only, ally. She knew, with chilling certainty, that the dawn would not just bring Thorn's riders, it would bring a final, lethal confrontation over the ghost of her husband's secret and the Apache's hidden knowledge. She stood, the rifle steady now, the doubt gone, replaced by a fierce, protective maternal rage. Her debt to him was now intrinsically linked to his ability to help her survive the coming morning. The final, desolate hours before true dawn were the most dangerous. The air grew intensely cold, the pre-sunrise chill biting through Alara's shawl, and the silence seemed to press down, amplifying every minor sound into a potential threat. Lyra coughed softly inside the cabin, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the stillness, and Alara flinched, instinctively pressing her back against the rough-hewn wood of the lean-to. Nantan, partially lucid now, was watching her movements with an unnerving intensity, his eyes tracking her anxiety. He seemed to draw strength not from rest, but from the urgency of their situation and the revelation of Thorn's true motive. He had confirmed the location of the rumored gold, a hidden ancient vein deep beneath the dry well, accessible through a forgotten shaft. This gold was not just a rumor of riches, it was a sacred site, a secret mining operation used by Nantan's ancestors, and Silas Thorn's grandfather had attempted to steal it decades ago, leaving a legacy of violence and blood that was now Alara's inheritance. The weight of this history, this deep-seated conflict, was the heavy internal battle of Chapter 4, Alara's struggle to accept that her small, dusty life was suddenly entangled in a grand, ancient drama of greed and betrayal. The sun was a mere suggestion of light behind the eastern peaks when Nantan finally shifted, his movements slow and agonizing but deliberate. He reached beneath the coarse blanket and pulled out a small, rolled-up square of soft tan deer hide. He pushed it toward Alara. "Map!" he rasped, the word tasting like sand. "Hidden path. Back of the canyon." Alara unrolled the hide, her breath catching as she saw the intricate charcoal-drawn lines. It was a precise, detailed map of the entire Two Forks Canyon region, showing not only the main trails, but also hidden springs, long-forgotten caves, and most importantly, a faint serpentine line leading from the back of her property, a sheer cliffside goat path that led directly into the high desert, circumventing the dangerous Thorn-controlled valley road. This was the "wait, what?" moment of the chapter, the physical manifestation of the Apache's deep knowledge and his commitment to her survival. He hadn't just saved his own life, he had provided the means for her escape. The map was the true currency of her sacrifice, far more valuable than the finest stallion. It was the key to freedom. However, the map also revealed a terrifying truth. Marked clearly with a small X-shaped symbol was the location of Thorn's main camp, not miles away in Redemption's Hold, but barely 3 miles distant, hidden in a rock formation overlooking the narrow canyon path. Thorn was not simply scouting her, he was waiting for her to break. His entire operation was set up to monitor her farm, applying a slow, suffocating pressure to force her surrender. The escalating tension was suddenly palpable. Thorn's men were close enough to hear a shouted word, close enough to see the smoke from her chimney, or worse, to see the 2 figures moving beneath the lean-to. This proximity intensified Alara's shame and guilt over Vigil's loss. If she had the horse, they could be on that escape path in minutes. But without him, she was forced to rely on a dying man's map and her own 2 feet, with Lyra to carry. The weight of this logistical impossibility nearly broke her resolve, causing a brief, sharp tremor in her hands that Nantan immediately noticed. He spoke again, his voice gaining a thread of strength, his words economical and driven. "Thorn, coming now. Sun up." He pointed toward the etching on the well, and then toward the map. "Must show them nothing. Must hide the truth. They watch. They wait. For weakness." His words were a clear, punchy twist in the narrative, a direct confirmation that their time was measured in minutes. The visual pacing quickened. Alara sprang to action, her movements stripped of fear and regret, fueled entirely by the need to protect Lyra. She took the map, rolling it quickly and stuffing it deep into the one place she knew Thorn's men would never search, a hollowed-out log beneath the loose stones of the hearth, a hiding spot known only to her and her late husband. She then moved back to Nantan, realizing that his visible presence was the most immediate danger. If Thorne's men found an Apache warrior, shot and wounded, on her property, they wouldn't need to ask questions. They would execute him, and Alara would be next, suspected of collaboration. The final moments before sunrise became a frantic race against the light. Alara gently, but with immense difficulty, helped Nantan slide into the deep, dry storage trench she used for root vegetables, covering him with burlap sacks and a light layer of loose dirt and straw, a desperate, terrifying form of burial. The movement was agonizing for the wounded man, but he endured it without a sound, his eyes locked on hers in a silent covenant of trust. He was hidden. The lean-to looked empty. She then scrubbed the floor of the lean-to with the last remnants of her well water, desperately erasing the dark, bloody stains, the coppery scent of the iron quickly dissipating into the dry, thirsty ground. She moved with the speed and precision of a hunted animal, every motion efficient, no filler, no wasted words. As the first thin rays of sun, the true visual bait of the scene, spilled over the canyon rim, painting the valley in streaks of gold and shadow, she looked out toward the horizon. And there they were, two riders, dark silhouettes against the blinding light, moving at a slow, deliberate pace toward her ranch. Silas Thorne's men. They were not subtle. They were arrogant. They had come to watch her break. The chapter ended on the agonizing suspense of Alara standing alone on her porch, the rising sun blinding, the blood debt hidden beneath the earth, and the enemy closing in, ready to finally put an end to her desperate defiance. The two riders from Redemption's Hold, lean and vicious men known only by their dusty monikers, Pike and Hoss, pulled up short of Alara's fence line, kicking up a final, theatrical cloud of red dust. The cloud hung heavy in the newly rising sun, a visual curtain separating the world of the civilized from the raw, dangerous reality of the frontier. Pike, the leader, was a tall, gaunt man whose eyes were permanently squinted against the sun and whose cruel, thin smile revealed too many gaps between his teeth. Hoss, a massive, silent man, sat his horse with the immobile menace of a boulder, his hand resting casually on the worn butt of his rifle. Their presence was a deliberate psychological assault, a clear message that the siege was intensifying. Alara stood her ground on the porch, her small frame silhouetted against the dark opening of the cabin door, the Winchester held casually but firmly in her hands. The tension was an almost physical thing, an emotional quiet moment before the inevitable, sharp, intense scene. She had taken special care this morning to look utterly unremarkable, a tired widow, not a fierce protector, hiding the storm of terror and resolve that was churning beneath her calm exterior. But the air around her smelled faintly of old iron and newly spilled blood, a scent she hoped the dry wind would carry away. Pike began the conversation with a lazy, drawling contempt that was designed to humiliate. "Well now, Mrs. Vance, heard tell you're down to your last drop of sanity." He paused, his gaze sweeping the dry yard, lingering on the empty corral. "Heard you let that fine bay stallion wander off. Reckon starvation's finally caught up to your good judgment." His eyes narrowed, searching for a reaction, a flicker of pain or remorse. This was the sudden conflict, the betrayal not of an action, but of a lie. Alara's decision to hide the truth of her sacrifice, the humiliating need to pretend the stallion had simply succumbed to the elements rather than being traded for a life. Alara met his gaze without flinching, her voice steady as the rifle in her hands. "Vigil went where he chose, Pike. I have enough feed for myself and my daughter. The drought will break." She offered a lie of cold, impossible hope, a refusal to show her hand. Pike dismounted slowly, letting the reins trail, his boots crunching loudly on the dry gravel, a deliberate violation of her space. His movements were slow, predatory, forcing her to hold her position, forcing the escalation of the encounter. "Hope is a dead commodity out here, ma'am," Pike countered, walking closer, the sun catching the brass fittings on his holster. "The boss, Mr. Thorne, he sent us to tell you he's feeling generous. He knows you're without a horse now, knows you can't get supplies. He'll offer you $500 in cash for the deed. No arguing. Sign it over, and you walk away with enough to start over. The offer was insulting. Barely a quarter of the land's original value, even in this scorched state. Elara gripped the rifle tighter, the wood warm beneath her fingers. The deeper motive was the secret Nantan had revealed. Thorn wasn't paying for dry land, he was buying the gold underneath it. The silence stretched, a high-stakes poker game where Elara held the weakest hand but the most important secret. She felt the heavy, beaded bracelet Nantan had given her pressing against her wrist, a silent reminder of the pact, a hidden thread of power she could not yet reveal. Elara lowered the Winchester only slightly, enough to signal defiance, not surrender. Tell Mr. Thorne he can take his $500 and buy himself a conscience. This land belonged to my husband, and now it belongs to Lyra. We are not leaving. This was the sharp break, the moment she shifted the energy from defensive to offensive, using the memory of her husband and the protection of her daughter to shield her true fear. Pike stopped 10 feet from the porch, his eyes suddenly hard and venomous. He dropped the pretense of negotiation. We saw the blood, Elara, he sneered, the name a chilling familiarity. Back of the lean-to, looked like a man got shot, then dragged off. The statement was a powerful, shocking reveal, a sudden, terrifying twist that proved Nantan's warning was accurate. They weren't just watching. They had been close enough to see the immediate aftermath. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, the internal trigger of panic activating immediately. Did they see Nantan? Did they know he was an Apache? Her mind raced, desperately trying to calculate how much they knew and how to deny the undeniable. She forced a harsh, humorless laugh, a sound that felt brittle and foreign. That was a mountain lion, Pike. Came after my last goat. I shot it and dragged it off for the vultures. She lied smoothly, trusting that the dryness of the ground and the time elapsed had hidden the true nature of the stain. If you think I'm lying, feel free to step onto my property and start digging. I'd love an excuse to shoot one of you for trespassing. The threat was audacious, born of raw desperation and the sudden empowerment of knowing their true objective. Pike and Hoss exchanged a glance, the threat of the Winchester in her hands momentarily holding them back. They didn't fear a woman, but they respected the long reach of a rifle and the legal mess of killing a settler over a land deal. They were here for the gold, not a pointless gunfight. Pike slowly remounted his horse, his eyes full of promised retribution. We'll be back, Mrs. Vance. And next time, the offer will be zero, and the eviction will be painful. You can't outlast the desert, and you can't outrun the boss. He turned his horse sharply, and both men retreated, swallowed once again by the red dust, leaving Elara alone with the terrifying knowledge that they had seen the blood. She waited until the last tremor of their departure had died out, then rushed back to the lean-to. She quickly moved the straw off the trench. Nantan was still there, utterly silent, his eyes open, watching her. He had heard every word. The silent pact had been tested, and neither of them had betrayed the secret. They had bought themselves a few more hours, but the price was now a guaranteed, violent return. The brief, tense confrontation with Thorne's men had bought Elara time, but it had also exposed the brutal speed of their timeline. Pike knew there was blood, and he knew it was fresh. They would not wait long to return and dig up her yard, not now that they suspected something was truly amiss. The emotional shift was immediate. The initial shock of the morning was replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. Survival now depended on speed and deception. Elara returned to the lean-to and gently uncovered Nantan, whose face was pale but whose eyes held a fierce, undimmed clarity. He had listened to the entire exchange, the tension of the scene absorbed by his stillness. He pointed one trembling finger toward the well, his gaze demanding immediate action. Now, must go. The rhythm of the story accelerated again, demanding immediate physical movement toward the climax. The well, A circular stone structure in the center of the dusty yard had always been the heart of the farm, and now it was the epicenter of their shared danger. Ilara retrieved her late husband's pickaxe, a heavy, rusting tool, and stood over the dry, rock-lined hole. Nantan, still unable to walk, directed her with small, sharp gestures. He indicated a specific, large foundation stone on the southern side of the well's lip, the very stone that bore the faint, feathered snake etching he had described earlier. This repeated image, the ancestral symbol, was the subtle visual thread carrying the deeper history. Ilara worked with a desperate fury, the pickaxe striking the hard, dry earth with a metallic clank that felt dangerously loud in the quiet midday. She dislodged the stone, which was surprisingly loose, revealing not the dry earth she expected, but a small, carefully concealed aperture leading down into the dark. It was a shaft, narrow and vertical, expertly hidden beneath decades of dust and disuse. Nantan explained, in low, urgent whispers, that this was the kivar, the sacred breathing hole, used by his people to descend to the true mineshaft beneath. It was the ancestral entrance to the gold vein. He directed Ilara to retrieve the map from the hearth and study the instructions he had drawn, which showed the location of a supporting beam inside the well's main shaft, a beam that held the key to opening the main gold shaft below. He also warned her that Thorn was not merely looking for the gold, he was looking for the map itself, which detailed not only the gold's location, but also the intricate hidden tunnels and caches of water that were essential for any long-term survival in the high desert. This was the escalating conflict. The secret was not just wealth, but knowledge, survival knowledge that only the Apache possessed. Ilara quickly recovered Nantan, replacing the straw and dirt, and then without hesitation, she tied the rope used for fetching water to a sturdy post, and, clutching a lantern in one hand, began her descent into the well. The dry, earthen shaft smelled of cold rock and ancient dust. The walls were rough and unforgiving, and the descent felt like falling into the earth's throat. She reached the dry, rock-strewn floor of the main well chamber and saw the supporting beam Nantan had described. It was a thick, dark length of cedar, deliberately placed. Following the directions on the deer-hide map, the physical proof of Nantan's commitment, she worked her fingers into the gap between the beam and the wall. She found a stiff, oiled lever, a hidden mechanism her husband had likely discovered and kept secret. With a tremendous heave, she pulled the lever down. The sound was deafening, a grinding, terrible moan of stone against stone, and a heavy section of the well wall swung inward, revealing a dark, cramped tunnel that descended at a sharp angle. This was the wait, what? Moment of the chapter, the dramatic visual realization that she had been living atop a multi-generational secret, a hidden world of immense value and danger. She was literally standing in the epicenter of the conflict. As she peered into the black, dust-choked tunnel, a slight, almost imperceptible detail caught her eye just outside the perimeter of the well opening, high on the western rim of the canyon. A subtle flash of light, not sunlight glinting off a rifle, but a shimmer of fine, almost colorless glass. It was a spyglass, a powerful lens, reflecting the intense sun. Her stomach lurched with the sickening realization of a new, unseen danger. Pike and Hoss were gone, but Silas Thorne had not left her unobserved. He had a dedicated, skilled watcher posted, equipped with a high-powered telescope, a silent eye that had seen every movement, every moment of her frantic activity near the well, perhaps even the flash of the pickaxe. Thorne wasn't just waiting for her to break, he was waiting for her to show him where to dig. The arrogance was astonishing. The humiliation of being so utterly transparent ignited a fierce, protective rage within her. She was the star of a drama she hadn't asked to join, and the unseen watcher was the only audience. Knowing she was being watched, Ilara changed her entire posture. She pretended to give up. She pushed the swinging wall back into place with a desperate grinding effort, sealing the tunnel shut. She climbed slowly out of the well, laboring visibly, and replaced the large foundation stone, covering the evidence with a final, deliberate sweep of dust. She then stumbled toward the porch, clutching her head, sinking onto the steps in a posture of complete, utter defeat, allowing the unseen watcher to believe that the well was a bust and that the widow had given up. But beneath the show of weakness, her mind was racing. She had bought herself a few hours of confusion. The escalation was clear. Thorn was too impatient and too suspicious to wait for long. If he had seen her working the well, he would assume she was hiding something, not that she had failed. He would send the men back to dig. The only way to save Nantan and Lara was to use the very danger she was in as a shield, to draw Thorn's attention away from the secret tunnel and back to the empty, dusty desert. The feeling of being watched, the chilling knowledge of the high-powered lens fixed on her, was the internal trigger that cemented her final, desperate plan. She had to become the bait. The next few hours were a dizzying blur of calculated, terrifying movements designed solely for the eyes of the unseen watcher on the canyon rim. Ilara's demeanor had completely shifted. The tired widow was gone, replaced by a desperate, theatrical actress. She deliberately began to pack a small saddlebag, the only one she owned, with worthless items: a handful of dry beans, a spare rag doll belonging to Lara, and a half-empty box of matches. The action was slow, visible, and utterly convincing in its depiction of failure. She needed Thorn to believe that she had searched the well, failed, to find the gold, and was now preparing for a humiliating, starving retreat to Redemption's hold, leaving the land and the secret behind. This was the intense emotional rhythm of the chapter, mixing the raw fear of exposure with the cold focus of her deceptive performance. Her biggest challenge was Lara. The 5-year-old sensed the profound, internal distress of her mother, and the enforced silence was fraying the child's nerves. Alara took Lyra into her lap, sitting in the dusty doorway, giving the unseen watcher a clear, pathetic visual of their last moments on the farm. She spoke to Lyra not about danger, but about an adventure to see her Auntie Clara, infusing her voice with a false, bright hope that made her stomach churn with guilt. "We must be very quiet, my sparrow," Alara whispered, tucking a stray lock of hair behind Lyra's ear. "It's a game, darling. You must pretend you're only carrying the things we need for a very long walk." The moment was a necessary, emotional lie, an agonizing choice to protect her daughter by deceiving her. Meanwhile, Nantan, hidden beneath the straw in the trench, could only hear the murmurs and the silence, his own heart pounding with the agonizing knowledge that Alara was risking everything for their shared survival. He realized with a terrifying certainty that the Apache debt was now secondary to the overwhelming maternal love he was witnessing, a force more powerful than any gold or bullet. The emotional stakes ratcheted up when Alara noticed a plume of smoke rising from the base of the canyon, a small, dark column directly where the escape map indicated Thorn's camp was situated. The smoke was a signal, a dark language only the watchers understood. It meant the men were being called in. Thorn had seen her packing and had decided the waiting game was over. They were coming to claim the farm and possibly to clean up the loose ends. Alara knew she had only minutes. She rushed to the small cemetery plot near the fence line where her husband lay buried. The emotional break was sudden and sharp. She didn't pray. She worked. She dug a small, shallow trench near the headstone and placed the only valuable thing she still possessed inside: her husband's worn leather journal, which contained not maps of the gold, but detailed emotional letters to Lyra and herself. If she died, this was all she had left to give her daughter. In a move of audacious confidence designed to confuse the watcher, Alara then did the unthinkable. She marched straight to the dry well, pulled the rope off the post, and flung it carelessly into the shaft, as if destroying her last means of accessing water or retrieving anything from below. The watcher, assuming she was destroying evidence of her failure, would be momentarily satisfied. This reckless action was the necessary pattern break, a sharp twist of feigned desperation. She then grabbed the packed saddlebag and, holding Lyra's small, trembling hand, walked with exaggerated slowness toward the north fence line, the direction of Redemption's hold, and the direct path to Thorn's waiting riders. She was walking straight into the jaws of danger. As they reached the fence line, Alara paused. This was her final vital movement. She looked directly at the canyon rim where she knew the spyglass glinted, holding the gaze of the unseen watcher for a long dramatic beat. She then turned her back and, with a final, heart-wrenching glance at the empty space where Vigil should have been, she started walking into the desolate open desert. They had barely taken 10 steps when Alara suddenly cried out, a sound of pure, sudden terror, and collapsed dramatically, clutching her ankle. Lyra, following her mother's silent instruction, began to wail, a truly authentic sound of childish fear that tore at Alara's heart. Alara quickly pulled Lyra into the cover of a thick patch of mesquite, whispering fiercely into her ear, "Stay silent, Lyra. No matter what you hear. We are hiding now." The sight of the injured woman and the crying child would satisfy the watcher. They would now assume Alara was either incapacitated or hiding from the heat, buying them precious minutes. Alara waited until the first sounds of hooves pounding the hard earth reached her ears. Thorn's men were closing in. Her plan was simple. The moment they rode past, assuming she had collapsed on the road ahead, she would double back. She crawled slowly, painfully, dragging Lyra with her, not towards the cabin, but towards the Kivar entrance near the well, where Nantan was waiting, fully armed with the knowledge and the sheer audacity of her sacrifice. The dust of the approaching horses grew thick, the danger immense, and the life of her daughter hung on the desperate silence of one hidden man and the cunning of one heartbroken woman. The climax was about to break. The thundering sound of hooves intensified, shaking the dry earth around their hiding spot. Pike and Hoss, riding hard and fast, their mission now one of final execution, didn't bother to check the deserted road carefully. They saw the dramatic collapse and the trail of dust leading ahead, and they rode past the mesquite bush, their boots and faces grim with intent. They were focused on reaching the ranch house, securing the property, and then collecting the incapacitated widow. This brief window, the passing of the storm, was their only chance. Alara waited until the sound of the horses was muffled by distance, then pushed Lyra ahead of her, crawling rapidly back toward the well. Nantan was ready. He had pulled himself halfway out of the trench, leaning heavily on the wooden lip, his face slick with sweat, but his eyes blazing with a fierce, adrenaline-fueled focus. He didn't waste a moment on words. He took Lyra into his good arm, holding her small, light body securely against his chest. Lyra, seeing the powerful wounded warrior, startled, but her fear was immediately replaced by a profound instinctive trust, a reaction that pierced Alara's heart. The Apache's wound, however, was bleeding freely now from the exertion, the sharp coppery scent of his own life force a stark reminder of the immense cost of this escape. The emotional wound deepened. He was destroying himself to honor the life debt. Alara swiftly reopened the small Kiva shaft and, with a nod to Nantan, began to descend the tight space first. The air in the underground shaft was cool and stagnant, a blessed relief from the scorching desert sun. But the descent was agonizingly slow and dangerous, made worse by the need to support the wounded man and the child. Nantan, gripping the rope with the last of his strength, pushed Lyra ahead of him into the opening, then slowly lowered his own body down, guiding his weight with his uninjured leg. Every movement sent a jolt of raw agony through his chest, but he refused to make a sound, the silence a monumental effort of will, a refusal to betray the woman who had saved him. They landed on the floor of the main well chamber with soft thuds, the dust swirling in the beam of their small lantern. Alara quickly pulled the lever, and the hidden tunnel wall groaned open, revealing the black shaft that led to the mine. But as she did, the sound of the front door of her cabin being kicked in echoed down the well shaft, a terrifying, Final notification that Thorne's men were now inside. "Pike's in the house," she hissed, the urgency a physical knot in her throat. She pushed Lyra into the tunnel. Just as Nantan was about to follow, the sound of boots on the stone lip of the well froze them. Pike and Hoss were back, realizing their mistake, the watcher having signaled that Alara was not on the road but doubling back. Pike peered down the dark hole, his voice echoing with menace. "Alara, I know you're down there, and I know you found the way. Come up now and tell us where the entrance to the shaft is, or we burn the whole damn place down. We'll start with the child's bed." The escalation was complete. The conflict was now a pure, terrifying standoff between a mother's will and a land baron's greed. This was the highest emotional tension of the story. Alara, shielding Nantan with her body, knew she couldn't outfight them. She needed a distraction. Nantan reached out, his hand wrapping around the thick coiled rope. With a final agonizing pull of his good arm, he severed the rope against the sharp, jagged stone edge of the well lip, letting the cut end dangle just out of reach. "Go!" he croaked to Alara, pushing her toward the tunnel entrance. The rope, their only way back out, was gone. They were trapped below ground. This was the big wait, what? Moment of the chapter. A decisive physical move that sacrificed their immediate means of escape for the absolute guarantee of their temporary secrecy. Pike roared in frustration from above, realizing they had been cut off. Alara didn't hesitate. She grabbed Nantan and pulled him into the dark tunnel, the small lantern beam casting dancing, frantic shadows on the rough-hewn rock. As they moved deeper, the earth above them began to shake violently. Pike, in a fit of furious desperation, had started using Hoss's pickaxe to smash open the sealed entrance near the well wall, creating a massive, thunderous sound of destruction. The dust in the tunnel became thick and suffocating, the air turning thin and coppery. Alara pressed the child's face against her shoulder, pulling the wounded man forward. They were now entombed, fleeing deeper into the earth toward the unseen secrets of the gold mine, with the hatred and greed of the surface world raining down on them. The price of the bargain, the life she had saved, was now their only chance for survival. The descent into the old Apache mine was a nightmare of claustrophobia and agony. The tunnel was steep, wet, and slick with clay, forcing Alara to half carry Nantan while guiding Lyra. The air grew heavier, scented not with dust, but with the rich, mineral tang of unworked earth and something else, a faint, ancient scent of smoke and ceremony. Lyra, exhausted but fortified by her mother's fierce grip, managed to remain silent, clutching the small, heavy beaded bracelet Nantan had given them, the silent symbol of their alliance. The physical exertion was excruciating for Nantan. The bandage on his chest was now soaked through, and his breaths were coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He was fading rapidly, the last of his energy being spent on directing Alara through the maze of support timbers and narrow cuts. Finally, the tunnel opened into a large, cold chamber, the ancestors' vein. It was not a chaotic settler's dig, but a vast, orderly chamber carved from the rock centuries ago, illuminated by an eerie, pale blue light filtering down from narrow, natural vents high above. The walls were veined with thick, raw streaks of gold, gleaming dully in the dim light, the sight of untold wealth and astonishing, breathtaking visual bait. This was the source of Thorne's obsession, the physical proof of the secret that had cost Alara her horse and nearly her life. Nantan immediately slumped against a cold, smooth stone bench carved into the wall, pointing a weak finger toward a small, dark pool of water nestled in a hollowed-out basin. "Water? Clean," he whispered, a guttural sound of deep physical exhaustion. The pool was fed by a secret underground spring, the true source of life in this arid canyon, the knowledge that Nantan's map had promised. The Kiva was not just a passage to gold, it was a sanctuary of survival. Alara knelt, cupping the cold, clear water for Nantan, but he shook his head, pointing instead to Lyra. "Child first, then me." Even in the throes of death's grip, the warrior's discipline and debt of life held firm. The moment was an intensely emotional, quiet scene, a testament to the man she had saved, the man who was now dying to protect her. "Daughter." Ilara helped Lyra drink, then turned her attention to Nantan. She knew the end was near. His body was failing, the lack of air, the loss of blood, and the final, brutal exertion had taken its toll. She took his hands, her touch gentle but firm, and looked into his eyes, now clouded with the shadow of death. "You will not die here, Nantan," she choked out, a final desperate refusal to accept the failure of her sacrifice. Suddenly, a loud grating sound echoed from the tunnel entrance. Pike and Hoss, fueled by greed and fury, had finally smashed their way into the well chamber and found the concealed entrance to the mine. Their heavy, uneven footsteps, coupled with the scrape of their rifle barrels against the stone, echoed ominously through the cavern. They were close, their voices brutal and loud. "We hear you, woman. You can't hide that gold. We'll tear this mountain down." The tension exploded into the highest level of physical danger. Ilara had no exit. She was trapped in the tomb of the ancestors with a dying man and her daughter, facing two armed and desperate killers. Nantan pushed the heavy, beaded bracelet into Ilara's hand again, his voice now a mere, reedy whisper, his eyes fixed on the entrance of the tunnel. "Listen, horse, debt, fulfilled." His eyes closed. She felt the last thread of life leave his body, a silent, profound release of breath. The debt was paid, but the cost was absolute. Ilara looked at the dead warrior, then at her terrified daughter, and then at the tunnel entrance where the shadows of the two men began to flicker. Her initial despair was replaced by cold, burning resolve, a fierce maternal rage that was the final, defining emotion of the story. She had traded her only horse, and now she had lost the life she saved. The debt was settled, but the justice was not. She quickly grabbed the heavy raw turquoise stones Nantan had offered her earlier, the stones that were worthless in town, but sacred here. She placed them carefully on the dead warrior's chest as a final, silent farewell. Then she looked up, her eyes blazing, and saw a solution revealed by the strange filtering light. A tiny, natural chimney, a narrow crack leading straight up to the canyon surface. It was too small for her, but a desperate, final exit. She shielded Lyra behind the stone bench, handed her the rifle, and whispered, "Stay here. Don't move. Don't make a sound. I'm coming back for you." She grabbed a handful of the raw, gleaming gold from the vein wall, not as a treasure, but as a weapon, a devastating distraction. She was going to draw them away, not just to survive, but to honor the sacrifice of the man who died to protect her secret. Ilara didn't climb out. She exploded from the ground. She forced her way through the narrow chimney, scraping her flesh on the rock, emerging onto the canyon floor far from the well, in a thick patch of mesquite near the high rim. The sun was now high, beating down on the dust-choked land. She heard the shouts of Pike and Hoss echoing from the mine entrance below, their voices frustrated and muffled. They were searching the ancestors' vein, blinded by the gold, never expecting her to find an alternative exit. She quickly gathered several large sharp-edged rocks and the handful of gold ore she'd brought, and she began to climb the final, sheer face of the rim toward the position of the unseen watcher. She found the watcher exactly where he was supposed to be, lying prone behind a natural rock barrier, his high-powered spyglass fixed on the mine entrance, oblivious to the threat behind him. Ilara didn't hesitate. She threw the heavy chunks of gold ore and sharp rocks at the man's head, a violent, sudden assault that shattered the spyglass and sent the watcher sprawling, momentarily stunned. He was a low-level thug, armed but slow. Ilara disarmed him quickly, retrieving his heavy, high-powered hunting rifle and his wide-brimmed hat. She did not kill him. She tied him securely with his own belt to a nearby boulder and left him to the sun, a visible, humiliating trophy. She was no longer running. She was delivering a message. She put on the watcher's hat, obscuring her face, and picked up the high-powered rifle, a massive, devastating weapon, far superior to her Winchester. She then walked to the highest point of the canyon rim, a place where the wind howled and the entire valley stretched beneath her. She raised the rifle, aiming it not at the mine, but at the rickety wooden supports of the old, defunct water tower near the property line, a structure Thorne's men often used as a lookout. She took a deep breath, and with one devastating shot, she split the main support beam. The tower collapsed with a tremendous splintering crash that echoed across the entire canyon, a sound that drew the furious attention of Pike and Hoss from the mine below. The two men exploded from the well entrance, seeing the rising dust cloud from the collapsed tower, their eyes sweeping the landscape for a threat. Elara didn't wait. She raised the rifle again and fired 3 more shots into the air, the blasts sounding like cannons in the still air. She was drawing them out, becoming the bait. And then, as if summoned by the gunshots, the sky exploded with movement. From the very same mountains where Vigil had vanished, a dark, flowing river of motion poured down the slopes. It was a herd of wild mustangs, 100 strong, their coats sleek and powerful, their manes flying like dark banners in the wind, led by a magnificent bay stallion whose coat shimmered like dark mahogany in the sun. Vigil. Vigil had not simply run away. He had followed the primal code of the desert, seeking out his own kind, finding the lead stallion of a massive, powerful herd. He had returned, not just alone, but leading the entire wild force, drawn back by the very gunshots that called to the wild spirit. He returned to pay the life debt Nantan could, not. The sight was the final stunning resolution, the perfect cinematic bait. The widow's sacrifice had been paid 1,000-fold. Pike and Hoss, seeing the massive, uncontrolled herd bearing down on them, let out cries of panic. They tried to remount their horses, but the wild animals, stampeding toward the noise and the scent of human fear, were an unstoppable force. The herd passed over the mine entrance like a living tsunami, the thunder of their hooves shaking the entire valley. The mine entrance, already weakened by Pike's desperate digging, collapsed with a terrifying, final groan of rock and timber, burying the ancestral secret, the gold, and the 2 killers beneath tons of stone and dust. Justice, silent and wild, had been delivered. Elara stood on the rim, the hatch shielding her eyes, watching the wild herd vanish back into the mountains, Vigil giving one final powerful toss of his mane before disappearing. She waited until the dust settled, the silence now profound and absolute. She then slowly climbed down and returned to the quiet cabin. She went down into the ancestor's vein, pulled the small Lyra from behind the bench, and held her tight. She then retrieved Nantan's body, wrapping him in the familiar woolen blanket. At dawn the next morning, Elara Vance buried Nantan on the high ridge overlooking the canyon, placing the carved bone bracelet on the makeshift grave, a tribute to the man who died to honor his debt. She took only one thing from the chamber, the deer hide map, which she used to lead Lyra out of the canyon, not toward Redemption's hold, but toward the hidden spring and the ancient trails, guided by the Apache's silent, profound knowledge. She left the gold, the debt paid, the horse redeemed, and the land forever silenced. She walked away a survivor, not a victim, empowered by the impossible sacrifice that had yielded a herd of redemption. The canyon was theirs no longer. It belonged to the wild spirit and the ancestors. Elara stood on the rim, the hatch shielding her eyes, watching the wild herd vanish back into the mountains, Vigil giving one final powerful toss of his mane before disappearing. She waited until the dust settled, the silence now profound and absolute. The valley lay still, the only sign of the morning's violence being the massive fresh pile of rock and timber that sealed the mine entrance, a spontaneous final justice delivered by the earth itself. Thorne's operation was over. His men and his greed were buried beneath the very mountain they sought to exploit. She felt an overwhelming exhaustion, but beneath it, a cold, fierce satisfaction. She had fulfilled her promise to herself. She had survived. and the life she saved had, in turn, saved hers. She slowly climbed down and returned to the quiet cabin, the watcher's rifle a heavy, unnecessary weight in her hand. She was now the owner of silence. She went down into the ancestor's vein, her lantern cast in a steady, unwavering light on the scene. She pulled the small Lyra from behind the stone bench, and the child, seeing her mother alive and safe, rushed into her arms, silent tears finally escaping in a rush of relief. Alara held her tight, the feel of her daughter's fragile, precious life extinguishing the last embers of her fear. They were safe. She then returned to the cold, still form of Nantan. She lifted the body with reverence, wrapping him in the familiar woolen blanket, the last item of her husband's she possessed. She looked one last time at the raw, gleaming gold vein, the source of so much pain and conflict, and felt no desire, only cold indifference. The gold was a curse. The life debt, however, was a blessing. At dawn the next morning, Ilara Vance buried Nantan on the high ridge overlooking the canyon, the spot chosen for its commanding view of the ancestral lands and the newly silenced valley. She dug the grave herself, the heavy work and necessary physical release for the terror and tension of the night. She placed the carved bone bracelet he had given her on the makeshift grave, a silent tribute to the man who died to honor his debt, an unbreakable pact forged in blood and sacrifice. She took only one thing from the chamber, the deer hide map, a parchment of ancient knowledge that represents survival, not wealth. She had the secret paths, the hidden springs, the way out. She led Lyra out of the canyon, not toward the dusty, unforgiving road to redemption's hold, but toward the hidden spring and the ancient trails marked on the Apache map. They carried only the essentials, leaving the cabin, the farm, and the haunting memories behind. She knew the map would lead them to her sister, to a safe harbor, or perhaps to a new beginning, deeper in the high desert where the greed of men could not follow. The last image of the story was Alara Vance walking away, her small figure and her daughters swallowed by the vast open land, a woman walking not from failure, but from a profound, impossible redemption. The canyon was theirs no longer. It belonged to the wild spirit and the ancestors, their secret safe, their peace finally absolute. The sacrifice of a single horse had yielded not just a life saved, but a new path for a new life.